So, I mean, as much as you feel comfortable, do you want to just share this part of your story that you feel comfortable sharing in terms of those traumatic events that led up to depression or anxiety for you?
Absolutely. So it was quite a complex situation, and my eventual diagnosis was PTSD and anxiety.
Yeah.
Um, it predominantly revolved around unsafe home environment where there was elements of domestic violence going on. And then on top of that, I had miscarried one of my children, which was
Mm,
quite heartbreaking. And then I was pregnant with my youngest, and for me, her pregnancy was normal for me, but when it got to the end, there were complications, and I ended up having a C-section that was not. I didn't have an appropriate spinal. It wasn't. It didn't
mm,
take properly, and so her birth was incredibly traumatic. I felt everything.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I struggled to process all of those elements together,
Mm,
and really find my footing after her birth.
yeah.
And it was just, I don't know, my firstborn was just so beautiful and so natural, and it just flowed. Everything was just as I felt it should be.
Mm,
Um, and it was very hard to reconcile that the subsequent birth was on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. And
yeah.
I just, everything that I had expected and wanted and hoped for in that birth just was gone. And
Mm.
I was left with a lot of pain. I was left with a huge amount of trauma. And I didn't have any support. And it was just a really difficult time to navigate.
Lots and lots and lots of mothers would so relate to that, you know. I remember when I was, um, I only had one child. Um, and when I was pregnant with him, I was so thrilled. I was thrilled to bits. And I remember going to the GP to confirm my pregnancy. And he told, and part of confirming my pregnancy was him telling me the ratio for miscarriage.
Hmm.
And it was like my excitement just got turned to anxiety immediately. I just had so little time to just enjoy that excitement. It was really horrible. I don't know, I'm not sure if it's best that people set you up to know that it could happen, or whether they should just leave you to enjoy it and deal with it when it happens. I'm not really sure which way is the best way, but I know that it sucked, it really sucked that I couldn't have just that one moment that was kind of
Yeah,
just
I hear you.
enjoying. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword. I
Yeah.
certainly I knew about the statistics with my firstborn, but
Mm.
and I think in your own world it will never happen to you is kind of how you
Yeah.
feel, and
Yeah.
certainly for my firstborn it didn't. But my in between baby, it did, and ironically, I had a feeling from the outset that things weren't going to progress so well,
Yeah.
and it still didn't take anything away from dealing with that. And
Mm.
I think when I started to be quite vocal about what had happened to me, because I felt so alone, I started to get private messages from friends and family that I never knew had miscarried their own children.
Yeah.
And I think it was really eye-opening to see so much loss and to hear
Mm.
people's stories. And it made me feel like I wasn't so alone in this, which was
Mm.
awful because I didn't want everyone else to be, or not everyone, but I didn't want a number of people to be feeling the same. But
Yeah.
I wasn't so isolated in it. But I
Yeah.
certainly carried the trauma of the miscarriage into my next pregnancy, and it made it
Mm.
very hard for me to relax into and embrace and fully enjoy that pregnancy, because I did feel like at any moment now this beautiful baby that I was growing might be taken away from me.
Mm.
And it took away the innocence of pregnancy and the real
Yeah.
pure joy and excitement. So that was a challenge too. It was
Yeah.
very, very different. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it seems like with miscarriage, I'm not sure why, but I don't know, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I don't feel like it's talked about enough.
Um,
It's sort of like it's really common, but when it happens to people, I've noticed that there's not a lot of open sharing about it. And people just say, I'm sorry, but that's kind of it. And obviously, in your case, you had people reaching out to you privately. But do you feel, would you agree with that, that there's not a lot of kind of conversation happening around miscarriage?
totally, 100%. And I think as a person, I want to make sure that others don't suffer the same fate that I have in any of the trauma elements that I've had in my life, or at least if they do, that they feel there's an avenue that they can access to have a conversation in a safe space.
Yeah.
One thing I found quite shocking with my miscarriage was the number of people who said to me, "Oh, it doesn't really matter. You went that far along." And I was like,
Oh,
I was about 9 weeks. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't, quote, that far along. But
mm,
I don't think that some people can understand how much it means to you when you get that positive pregnancy test. Like, you
yeah,
are there, you're committed. This is life
yeah,
changing, absolutely
yeah,
life changing. And
mm,
you've still lost a baby. And then there's the whole actual act of miscarrying and
yeah,
managing to get back to normal after a miscarriage. So it was, yeah,
yeah,
it was a really tricky path, and it's not talked about often enough. And I feel like there's not really a lot of safe space available to have those conversations without judgment or
mm,
well-meaning but poorly worded sort of, engagements with friends or family. I
yeah,
certainly felt like I was hiding from the world for a while I just tried to deal with it.
yeah, which is that is sort of uh makes the whole experience worse because that you have to you feel this need to hide away, like you probably want to hide away, but also I'm just wondering because is there do you kind of feel like or did you feel that you had to hide that grief because other people had moved on from the news or
That's such a good question. Um, I felt that there was a lot of pressure in society to not dwell on it, and that, like, yep, it's happened.
mm,
It's time to, hustle along now. Let's just get on with it. Whereas there was still my heart that was feeling quite broken, and I still felt the grief of loss, but no one was, not no one. I definitely had supporters, but as
yeah,
a general concept, society wasn't prepared to let that grief be there. And grief's
yeah.
really uncomfortable for other people too.
It
And
it's uncomfortable for everyone.
totally,
I'm not a
yeah.
fan.
Me either. But it was quite funny and almost telling to watch how people reacted to the news that you
Yeah.
were sharing. Some people that I expected to be supportive weren't.
Mm,
Some people I didn't think were going to be supportive were. And it kind of shifted the way I felt about a lot of people as well, including
yeah.
not my immediate family. They were incredible, but some of my more extended family really shocked me. And
Mm,
yeah, it took me a long time to recover from that. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, so it just kind of adds a layer, doesn't it, too? Because you've got the grief itself, but then you've got the grief around the lack of support or the challenge around hiding, feeling this pressure to hide it or to feeling this pressure to move on from it and not mention it anymore.
Yeah,
Um,
for
I
sure.
can imagine, like, I mean, I don't want to imagine really, but I can imagine, like I remember when I was pregnant, I couldn't believe it. Like I was just the high was amazing because it was a surprise to me. We wanted to get pregnant. We just didn't know that we'd get pregnant so quickly. And
Nice.
I remember taking the pregnancy test like 6 times before I believed it. And, and going out to the restaurant and celebrating and all of that stuff. If I had miscarried at 9 weeks, I would have been devastated, absolutely devastated. Um,
Yeah.
so, um, I mean, classic grief symptoms. Are there anything other, because we know, with grief, there's often shock and denial and sadness and sometimes depression and anger and bargaining. If only I hadn't done this, then maybe that wouldn't have happened, and all of that kind of thing. what else do you think, what other sort of feelings were you experiencing?
I definitely had all of those.
Mm.
And I think um, because it was a missed miscarriage, and it was really the actual process of miscarrying for me wasn't straightforward. It was a very long, sort of 3.5 month journey to finally get to the end of miscarrying. Um, there was a lot of frustration and upset and anger and just like almost disdain that this could happen to me. Like it was bad enough that I miscarried. Why did I need to be subjected to this ongoing, quite traumatic feelings? And I'm sure many people who have had a miscarriage will probably relate to this. And
Mm.
there's not a very quick action to do anything surgically to help you manage your miscarriage, especially if it's a missed miscarriage. So that means
Mm.
a missed miscarriage is where your baby's passed away, but your body hasn't recognized that yet. And
Mm.
so I found it like a ticking time bomb that I was literally walking around, and a lot of the information I was given was, like you're gonna start bleeding, it's gonna be really heavy, you'll probably need to come to hospital to help us try and manage that for you. And so for about a week, I was walking around just waiting, basically what I felt like was to just basically burst into this massive bleeding, hemorrhaging scene that was going to need, pretty intense medical care. Um,
Mm.
and that was really challenging to deal with. And I had a young child at the same time too, and I was still expected to parent like there was no grief or loss there,
Yeah.
and yet still try to somehow mentally take care of myself. And
Mm.
it just wasn't a very conducive environment.
Yeah.
There wasn't the wraparound support that I feel that should be available. There wasn't much mental health support. I mean, I didn't
Yeah.
get anything. I had to pay privately to get some support.
Mm.
So it was all in all, it was just an absolute nightmare. I honestly thought that I was just in this alternative dimension where everything was just really off off the cuff crazy.
Yeah.
And one
Yeah.
day I was going to wake up soon, but it just didn't happen, unfortunately. I
Mm.
did get through it, but I mean, there was a fair amount of counselling that I needed to have,
Yeah.
and still to this day, I mean, we're talking the years and years later. I still at times get, not necessarily from the miscarriage, but certainly from the trauma of everything. I still need to see a therapist every now and again just to, reset
Mm.
my mind and get myself into a healthier space. Um,
Yeah.
Took
Yeah.
a lot of work.
I think there are definitely things that around, things that would lessen the trauma or the impact of it. If, there's sort of a series of circumstances that kind of, health professionals, for example, could make it easier. I remember with Nathan, I can't remember how many weeks along I was. Um, I feel like I was 12 weeks, but I might have been less than that. I started bleeding and having cramps, and I went to the hospital. I'd had an upset that day. And I went to the hospital, and I was admitted, and I had to sit in the waiting room for ages and ages. And what I overheard the nurses say in the nurses' station, they said, they were joking about me. They said, "Oh, she's had a fight with her husband and now she's bleeding," and they were laughing about it.
Oh, so
And
that's terrible.
I was so shocked, and it was, I did make a complaint to the charge nurse, and the charge nurse basically took care of me for the rest of their shift, and I had to stay overnight. I mean, they can't do anything, but they
Yeah,
kept me overnight, and then they sent me for a scan the next morning to see. It's a horrible, but that was a really horrible experience. And I just kind of, those are the sorts of things that can happen that actually cause the trauma, or at least add to it,
for
those
sure.
sorts of awful, unsupportive experiences. I don't even know how anyone could find that funny. And by the way, we hadn't had an argument. That was not what had happened.
I just think it's
um,
that lack of empathy and
yeah,
compassion and coming from a place of understanding. Uh,
yeah,
yeah, I think that's should be like at a base level how most people, well, in my view, everyone should run or work or function from a place of empathy, compassion, and understanding. We don't have to
yeah,
agree with what someone else is saying, but we can still be kind and compassionate and caring about their
yeah.
situation.
Yeah. And I think it's a shock because, you know, you expect nurses or you expect certain health professionals to have empathy in their role.
Mm,
So it's always a real shock when that doesn't happen. And from their perspective, they're probably thinking, oh, they've got people turning in up with chest pain and all sorts of, and maybe to them, you can't do much for a miscarriage, so what's the big deal? And it's so common. But what a horrible
yeah,
attitude to have about something that's so emotionally devastating for people, you know?
yeah, you're spot on. Absolutely right. Yep, for
Mm.
sure.
So that had an impact, obviously, on your next pregnancy. And do you feel, looking back, that you had antenatal anxiety even before the birth?
I definitely had anxiety during my
Yeah,
pregnancy
yeah,
and before the birth.
mm,
It was a lot to navigate. I had the unsettled home environment that was quite challenging to manage. And then I also had all the worry and the fear and the anxiety and stress about what might happen to this baby that I was carrying. And it made it quite a challenge and also looking after a young one and still working full time too. Um, it was a lot on my plate, and
mm,
it
mm,
felt at times almost insurmountable, but you're in it, the thick of it. You don't really have a choice. You just have to get on with it.
mm. Yeah. So, are you also able to kind of feel like, are you able to, I'm just tentatively asking you this because, I'm aware that sometimes sharing aspects of your story can be re-triggering. So just as much as you feel comfortable sharing, about the birth itself, what do you think were the components that, you sort of did an overview about the birth earlier, but, what were the components that led to a traumatic experience for you?
The single most biggest component for my birthing experience that added to my trauma would be that no one had faith in me as a parent or a person being able to birth my baby. That's literally all it boiled down to.
Mm,
My
mm,
my baby was in a not ideal position by hospital standards, but entirely normal position in the grand scheme of birthing. Um,
right.
there was really a lot of scaremongering done by the hospital to get compliance. They didn't want me to have a natural birth.
Mm,
They wanted me to schedule a C-section. Um, and just there was just a lot of misinformation, which subsequently since the birth I have researched and advocated for change here uh,
right.
around birth rights for mums.
Mm,
So my baby turned breech about 2 weeks before my baby was due. And so I've actively campaigned and gone through to get information and awareness around breech births. Um, and I feel that if one person had believed in me, then we wouldn't have gone down the route that we did go down.
right.
Um, and it was just so disempowering. And
Mm,
in my view, I felt purely like a vessel. I didn't feel seen. I didn't feel like I was
no.
part of any equation for a birthing discussion
Mm,
with a hospital. My midwife was amazing, but she was not in a position to deliver a breech baby because she didn't have the experience she needed.
mm,
And so, yeah, I really, at the end of the day, it just boiled down to feeling like the only thing that mattered was my baby. And
yeah.
don't get me wrong, my baby was really important, but equally still was the child I already had and
Yeah.
my ability to continue to raise my child and care for my child, which I didn't know if I was going to be able to do
Yeah.
um, after having a C-section.
So
So, yeah.
I'm hearing that it's interesting words to say, I felt like a vessel. So in other words, it was
Mm,
almost like they depersonalized you. And that
exactly.
yeah. Which is on its own is very, very traumatic. To be feeling like a non-person, to not have value during such
Yeah.
or be treated to feel like you did not have value. Um, so, um, that I imagine, I wonder if you disassociated from in order to cope with that at the time. Do you think? Do you know what I mean by that?
Um, I think I know what you mean. Did I disassociate? I felt there were,
Kind of
it was funny
disconnected
for
from
me.
your body a wee bit in order to cope with the way
Yeah,
that you're being treated.
it was quite funny for me because I found that I was quite um vocal and strong in my approach with
Wow.
hospital staff.
Yeah.
But, and this is the part that this is the cruncher for me, I advocated very, very hard for my right to birth
Mm,
naturally. And I
amazing.
brought case studies to the hospital saying that, the information you've got is dated. There's all these updated case studies. The information
Yeah.
here does not align with what you're saying. I've found information that needs to be looked at, but the hospitals wouldn't acknowledge that information. I was told they could only refer to the study done in 2001. They couldn't refer to anything else. And so yeah, I definitely stood my ground. My
Mm,
youngest was also very overdue. So I had a long battle, longer than most people would probably have.
yeah.
And when it came time to birth, though, and I got to the hospital, and it was just it was just so frustrating. I walked in the door, and it was the moment I walked in the door, it was things like, if you don't have a C-section, I'm worried you're going to kill your baby. There was
Wow.
an IV line put into my hand, and the lady who did it didn't get it right. And I said to her, look, it's really burning. I need you to take it out. And she was like, no, 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 it's fine. And I said, look, you need to take it out. It's burning.
Mm,
And she's like, no, no, I've got it. And I said, if you don't take it out now, I will. And so
mm.
she took it out. She looked at my hand. She goes, oh, sorry, my bad. And it was just like that basic.
Wow.
I felt like I was seen as the difficult patient.
Yeah.
There were emails that the hospital sent around about me that were
Wow.
inadvertently sent to me, and they were quite shocking from a perspective of a patient at the hospital. And there were definitely, I was told that I was a legal liability for the hospital, and they were going to have to get their lawyers to discuss whether or not I could birth naturally, which was super frustrating because I don't think that's anyone's legal right to tell me whether or not I can do that. It
That's
became quite
insane.
a, yeah, it became quite a crazy, I don't know, it was just so out of control.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
yeah, anyway, I got into hospital, and the really sad thing was just not one person in that room believed in me, not one.
Mm,
And I didn't have anyone to support me or back me up, and I felt like I was fighting a losing battle.
yeah.
And that made it really hard for me. So yeah, in the end, I consented to a C-section through absolute peer pressure.
Yeah. So you one of the common experiences with birth trauma is feeling like they had no, feeling like you don't have a voice, or
Mm-hmm.
that that if you did have a voice or tried to have a voice, that you weren't heard. And that sounds like that was your experience. And quite often, obviously you were advocating for yourself really strongly prior to going into labor. I don't know if you actually went into labor or were induced.
Yeah, no, I went into labor.
Went
Yep.
into labor.
I let
So
my
once you're
Yep.
in labor, that ability to advocate for yourself and the ability to be a strong advocate for yourself is really hard, because you're in
Mm-hmm.
pain, and you're feeling very vulnerable, and you really are relying on people around you to support you. And when they
Yep.
don't, that's a very traumatic experience, when they don't support you and you're in this vulnerable position, and you're not being heard and you're not being listened to, and your voice is, taken away, essentially. Mm,
Yeah, totally. My, with hindsight, and probably one of my, I don't want to say regrets, because from what happened has come so much positive stuff, which
mm,
is really valuable. And that wouldn't have happened if this hadn't played out the way it did. But with hindsight, if I were to speak to someone who's going through a similar position, I would strongly advocate that they have at least one or two people in that room that
Yeah.
have their interests at heart. So like a
Yeah.
doula or a family member, someone there who can say when you're at
Yeah.
the, like, I mean, I remember laboring, my contractions were about 2 minutes apart.
Mm.
They were really strong. They lasted for about 40 seconds. So I wasn't getting a lot of breathing space between the two. And I remember people trying to get me to make decisions and shoving paperwork in front of me, and it was just pure chaos.
Yeah.
And I still believed I could birth vaginally. I just still had that faith in myself, but not a single soul in that room shared that.
Mm.
And I think if I'd had one person who was like, actually, Sarah, I'm gonna I'm gonna talk to you between contractions. Let's have a look at what this is going to mean for you. And I believe that you've got this if you want to do it. I'm here to support you.
Mm.
That would have made a world of difference, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I too had a traumatic birth, and I won't go into the details of it, but I one of the things that I was really upset about was I was so realistic about my expectations, which can be, that can kind of sometimes expectations can be the thing that,
Mhm.
not having realistic expectations can be sometimes the thing that can lead to the trauma. But I had a birth. My midwife didn't ask me to go into a birthing plan. She didn't cover it with me, so I just wrote it myself and gave it to her. And I had this birthing plan that was kind of like, um, this is what I want ideally. If that can't happen, then I want this. And if that can't happen, then I
Yeah.
want this. And if that can't happen, I just literally down to the very last thing, which was, and if I have to have a C-section, I at least want to hold my baby, it is
Yeah.
as soon as he is delivered. And I didn't. I held him it was at least an hour, if not maybe even 2 hours, before I held him. And for me, that was the bit. All of it was very traumatic. A lot of it was very traumatic, but that was the thing that filled me with absolute grief, because by the time I did hold him, I was disconnected. I was overwhelmed
That's
with
really tough.
drugs. I was really tired, and I just was not. In fact, I slept, I think, for 2 or 3 days, literally solidly. Um, so I was really disconnected, and and I've had one child. It was a moment that I felt like they took away from me, and there was not a reason to.
Yeah.
The excuse given was, oh, the operating theatre is cold, and we didn't want him to get cold. And it's like, I don't need him. I didn't need him to be skin to skin with me. I just needed to hold him. He could be as wrapped up as you wanted him to
Yeah.
be. I just wanted to hold my baby. It was really horrible. So I just really feel like, yeah, just to point that out, really, that there are some very strongly held values that we go, or very sort of, things that we're holding dear as we're going into a
Yeah.
situation, and that is the part that needs to be listened to. And for me, I wasn't happy about all the other stuff that happened. There were lots of other things too, but that was the worst one. Um,
Yeah.
and when you kind of feel like it's unnecessary trauma, that's really hard to live with. It's
Yeah. I'm really
Yeah.
sorry that happened to you. That's awful. That really
Mm,
is.
yeah. And in my case, I was fortunate in that, um, I the hospital, I made a complaint, and the hospital completely agreed with me, and they said that they would make changes around that to ensure that that would happen in the future, which made me feel better. And I don't know if that's true. I hope it's true. Um,
Yeah.
and I did also complain about my midwife to the Health and Disability Commissioner, and unfortunately, and that was a whole series of things, and unfortunately, that was really not didn't really end in much. And that was just mainly
Mm.
for her neglect in picking up perinatal depression and anxiety, when she, she had so many opportunities, including me saying to her, I'm worried that I'm going to get perinatal depression and anxiety. and asking her, can you please refer me to maternal mental health? And none of those things happened. And she gave really poor support, and described me as being overly anxious. It's like, well, yes, because I had anxiety.
Yeah. That'd be a dead giveaway.
Yeah. It's like, oh, let's avoid her because she's overly anxious. Well, no, why don't we help her because she's anxious, you know? Yeah, but anyway, so that won't go into more of my story. But I guess for you with your experience, I think from memory you were saying, did you already have PTSD at that point, or did you develop that after the birth?
I think that's a really good question. I think that with the home situation the way it was, it's quite likely that I did have PTSD at that point, and if not, then I was certainly heading that way.
Yeah.
Diagnostically, that came about when I took myself to ACC for a medical misadventure with the C-section trauma, and they did a psychological assessment, and that's where that came up. That was quite a bit after the fact, but I think you're probably quite right in that it was sort of existing there.
It was sort of an underlying
sort of toxic.
Yeah. So
I think so. Yeah.
Yep.
I think so.
Looking back, when did you start experiencing those PTSD symptoms, do you think?
I think it was probably long before my my pregnancy with my youngest. There were definitely PTSD elements through miscarrying, and then I think that they sort of intensified. And PTSD is quite strange in that there's a trigger, and there's a lot of things that can trigger you. So sometimes, especially after having just miscarried, something as simple as seeing a pregnant person would get me upset.
Yeah.
And then part that was grief, but there was also a part of it that was like the trauma of like having been through this traumatic miscarriage. But certainly after my birth of my youngest, I found silly things like bright lights would trigger me off, and the smell of antiseptic or like a hospital smell would set me off. And I sort of started to question why these things were troubling me, and I sort of realized to myself that things weren't quite right, things weren't quite normal, and I wanted to be the best mum that I could be for the kids, so I needed to figure out what was going on. And and then from there I eventually diagnosed with PTSD and anxiety.
Yeah. So so you were triggered, you got to know what your triggers were. Often with PTSD there is kind of there's a few quite significant symptoms, I suppose, one of which falls into kind of avoidance, where so I don't know if that's that you experienced a lot of avoidance where you were avoiding triggers. So, you know,
yeah,
I don't
totally.
know. Yeah. So you're avoiding, and that can be quite problematic, you know, because if there's a lot of triggers and they're kind of daily life type triggers, that's a lot of avoidance. And for some people also avoiding talking about anything that might trigger them as well. Is that something that you experienced?
I was actually okay with talking about it because the more I talked about it, the more I felt it brought it into reality and made it like not this big ghost in the room type thing.
Right.
But certainly, I mean, there were silly things that would trigger me, and I would freeze, and I wouldn't like I mean, I still to this day struggle with anything surgical. Like the thought of me having to have a surgical process makes me quite anxious just thinking about it. But you know, I if someone had bright lights, I would freak out. And I was like, this is ridiculous, you know. There were it was just really starting to impact my ability to just be as a human, and in particular to be a mum. You know, I had children that needed to go to doctors and stuff like that, and I was struggling to cope with the smell of the doctor's surgery. I wasn't prepared to let it rule me. I needed to I needed to be able to function, and I just wasn't prepared to let it dominate my life. So yeah, but it's certain I knew that there was something wrong. Things weren't sitting right. I was avoiding things. I was getting triggered. I was getting really emotional and upset about things that would normally not affect me at all. Things just didn't quite make sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just needed
Yeah.
an answer.
Yeah.
Deal with it.
Yeah. So I guess with you mentioned freezing, because often that trauma response is fight, flight, or freeze. For you, was it mostly
Mm-hmm.
freeze?
It was a bit of both. Initially I would freeze, and then I'd want to fly.
And you
I
run.
remember being in a
Yeah.
hospital. Right. Yeah, and I would just freeze and I'd panic, and then I'd
Mm.
be like, and it would take me back to that operating table. And it was
Mm.
so insane. I'd be standing in a hallway with bright lights, and then next minute, like in my mind, I can see I'm on the operating table. I'm in agony. I can't communicate what's happening to me. I'm freaking out. And yeah, and as soon as that would happen, I would then just want to get out of there as quick as I could. I just
So
wanted
you'd
to
have
be
these kind
gone
of
from whatever
flashbacks.
was causing it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really strong
Yeah.
flashbacks.
Flashbacks. Yeah. And did you have any sort of hypervigilance? So you kind of hypervigilance is kind of like on the lookout for danger type thing. On the, really looking everywhere for danger. Some people have that symptom as well. That
Yeah, I think with hindsight looking back, what might have been considered, mum jitters or mum nerve or mum anxiety was probably a little bit driven by some of that stuff too.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah. And what about your sleep or nightmares or anything like that? How was that affected?
I was pretty lucky with the nightmare side of things. I didn't have
Mm.
so much to do with the birth. In the domestic violence side of things, I would have a lot of nightmares about,
Yeah.
people, my ex-husband coming to get me or breaking in and stuff like that. So that then led into hypervigilance at home by locking doors and getting extra levels of security. And,
Yeah.
um, that was the only way I could really rest with that. I
Mm.
found I did a lot of ruminating,
Yeah.
and that was a challenge. I didn't like going and being stuck and gnawing over the past so much. It was not where I
Mm.
wanted to be.
Yeah. So you're
And
kind
that
of
was
going
probably
over and
one of
over
the
the
biggest.
story a wee bit, were you?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Just constantly. And it took a fair bit of therapy to find a method that worked for me to stop that,
Yeah.
and to move forward. And it interfered quite a bit with my ability to just be present.
Yeah.
And that was a real shame. I didn't, yeah, looking
Yeah.
back, I wish I hadn't been that stuck in it.
Yeah. I mean, PTSD is hard. It's a trauma. Trauma is,
Mm.
it's something that's complex, to recover from. And and some people go over and over the story to try and resolve the story or of the trauma, and other people completely avoid the story and anything related to it,
Mm.
because that they don't want to deal with the so there's kind of these it's either one extreme or the other, usually with PTSD. um in your case, what helped in the end? Or, I mean, and it sounds like it's an ongoing journey for you. um what were some things that really, really helped?
Uh, the first thing for me was acknowledging that I needed help, and just like there's no shame in it. And
Mm.
I get quite frustrated when there's this stigma around mental health. In my view, we should all be looking after our mental health.
Mm.
And actually, there's absolutely no harm in talking to a therapist every now and again just to mentally check in with where you're at and if there's anything you need to process.
Yeah.
So it took me a wee while to say, and in part because I had been told constantly that I was a crazy psycho mental bitch and I needed to be locked up, and that I needed to go to a psych ward. I think there was an element of myself that felt if I did go and seek therapy, then I was making that narrative real. So eventually, when I realized that I needed to do something about this, I went and saw a psychologist, and we did a bit of therapy. I was really lucky. It only took about 10 sessions to work through the sort of grunty, chunky bits of it. And
Mm,
then I stepped into a counselling sort of relationship with a counsellor who's been amazing.
yeah.
But yeah, there were techniques that I learned, some CBT practices, and then just I think it also, as an individual, there needs to be a point where you say, I've had enough of this, and I'm
Mm,
prepared to to change this outcome and the way I feel, and I
yeah.
want to be in a better place.
I think
So yeah, I was quite driven by.
that's a really important thing to say, because what I've noticed as a therapist is that there is this desire to heal from trauma, but there's a terror. I would call it, almost describe it as terror around
Mhm.
having to face the trauma in order to resolve it. And so that can delay the getting help. And I think,
For sure.
as you were saying, you get to the point where I'm sick of what this is doing to my life. I'm sick of what it's doing to me, or all the things that ways in which it's impacting me. I'm ready to face this stuff. And that takes huge courage, massive amounts of courage. So for you to go, okay, I'm going to do these, and to really face it in 10 sessions, that's a lot of courage. Yeah.
I think I had a boots and all kind of approach though. Like I knew I
Mm,
was going to do this, and I was either committed to it or I wasn't. And for me, not being committed wasn't an option. My kids deserve better. I needed to be a better mum.
mm,
And my family and friends deserved better. They should have been able to have confidence and faith that I was going to be okay. And I deserve better.
yeah.
I've been through the ringer, and I just deserved to be better.
Mm.
And yeah, I'm eternally grateful for the path that I've walked, and I'm very pleased with where I am today. And it's the happiest I've ever been.
Wow, that's amazing. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you feel like you would want to say to anyone who has been through trauma of any kind, whether it's birth trauma or whether it's intimate partner violence or any other type of trauma, and they are showing signs of PTSD? Is there anything that you would want to say to them, or anything else that we haven't already covered?
I think I would say that there's help out there, and you don't have to do this alone. And even if that is as simple as finding a Facebook group that supports you for whichever avenue or mode of trauma you're going through, and you simply just sign up to that page, and you don't have to interact or engage with it. But if you just touch base and read what other people are going through and recognize that you're not alone,
Mm,
and there is help out there, and that
yeah,
support can be easily found. You're not alone. Yeah, it's really tough, and you're not alone.
yeah. Thank you so much, Emma. We just so appreciate you sharing so openly about your story. Because it's so difficult to talk about these things, but so many people experience them. So the fact that, they will be just so grateful to hear your story and to hear your advice and your wisdom. So I really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for letting me be here and talk about this. I appreciate it.